And Kevin, yeah, we can start recording. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And as I'm doing so, I'll say I didn't introduce myself. My name is Kieran, and I use they and them pronouns. Like Marty, I work for the Oregon Health Authority on the REALD and SOGI team. We're going to talk more about what that means in a moment. But I am a data equity research analyst, so I've got my fingers deep in the data and in thinking about how we implement data standards for collecting demographic information across the Oregon Health Authority. And so we are talking today about REALD and SOGI to give folks who, I don't know how much background Rowan offered in her communications with folks, but REALD and SOGI presented at the Data Equity Summit a few weeks ago. Marty and I gave a presentation about REALD and SOGI, and Rowan thought that some of our learnings from the work we've been doing around demographic data collection at OHA could help inform some of the work you all are doing on the sexual misconduct survey and thinking about how you're collecting demographic data. So we are here to share what REALD and SOGI is, how it came to be, some thoughts to make a case, as it were, for using these demographic standards if they can, help support your work and align with everything else you all are doing. So it's a small group. Feel free to ask questions. We can pay attention to raised hands and things like that. You can also drop questions in the chat as we move through. We're going to be talking a little bit broadly and generally about our work, and happy to pause to get in the weeds a bit if we need to, and if that's helpful. So with that, we will go ahead and move forward. So REALD and SOGI is an acronym, and we're really good at acronyms here at the state. Let me make sure I can see windows and such. 1 second here. Okay, there we go. Really good at acronyms here at the state. REALD and SOGI is a set of standards for collecting and reporting demographic data. And to give some context for that, REALD and SOGI is implemented across OHA. We are in the process of implementing it for all OHA and DHS programs and partners, and soon we'll also be implementing for all providers, insurers, and CCOs that collect demographic data. So it is not an exaggeration to say that within the decade, anyone who touches OHA, the health authority, that includes OHP, that includes all of our medical providers, doctors, clinics, insurers, et cetera, are going to be using the REALD and SOGI standards to collect demographic data. And there's a very, very good chance that if you received a COVID vaccine, got a COVID test, and even in many cases accessed healthcare in the last few years, that you have been offered the opportunity to fill out the REALD and SOGI demographic data questionnaire. So these questions and these standards may look familiar to you. But first, why? Why are we doing this? Why do we collect REALD and SOGI standard data? Why do we have a set of standards? And the answer is that we need standards in order to define populations. So we define populations because we can't understand social and health inequities unless we have well-defined populations. For example, it's useful to know that rates of influenza vaccine might be increasing, but it's more useful to know which groups of people are getting vaccinated at higher rates, to know, are rates increasing for everyone or only for people within a specific age bracket, only certain racial or ethnic groups, only women or men or non-binary people? Are there groups for whom vaccination rates are actually decreasing, but because there's an overall increasing trend, those folks' reality is being masked? And in order to answer questions like these, we have to collect people's demographic information. But understanding who someone is and how their identity informs their experiences and their health outcomes or their social outcomes is not simple. People are complex, societies are complex, and demographic information is actually complex. And so communities brought forward legislation starting in 2013 to demand more inclusive and accurate demographic standards in the state. So REALD and SOGI, as I said, is an acronym, and it's what came out of those legislative efforts. REALD stands for Race, Ethnicity, Language, and Disability. These were the original components of the legislation that was passed in 2013. These standards were updated in 2020 through a rulemaking process, and then updated again in 2024. So we're currently in the process of implementing a very recent update, to the standards on race, ethnicity, language, and disability. And then in 2020 and 2021, there was an effort to adopt standards that have been drafted for sexual orientation and gender identity as well. And those were included in legislation in 2021, with final standards being adopted in 2024. A note about demographic data standards is that people change over time. How they identify themselves changes over time. How communities identify themselves over time will change. And because of that, there is a built-in mechanism to the legislation that requires regular review and update to the REALD and SOGI questions. So we are not striving for the permanent, perfect questions to ask about people's demographics and lived experiences. Instead, we are acknowledging that it will never be perfect. These questions will, by their nature, need to shift and change over time to adapt to the different language that's being used, different ways that people are understanding themselves. And so the standards are not set in stone. And wanting to really bring home that the REALD and SOGI standards were initiated by community organizations. Community engagement and community leadership is the equity principle that our work really focuses on the REALD and SOGI team. Organizations brought forward the legislation, community organizations and community members were intrinsically engaged in every part of the process of developing and updating our demographic standards. We work with a community work group. We've got a lot of different diverse community partners engaged with these standards to ensure that they are serving the needs of those communities. And I will pass it to Marty.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit also about a little more about why we want to collect demographic data. And we see several reasons or several motivating values for collecting REALD and SOGI, and how much these apply is going to sort of vary from setting, and in some settings certain values will be really important, and in other settings they may not apply as much. But some of the reasons we ask REALD and SOGI are to create safe, inclusive, and welcoming environments when people feel seen, when they can represent their true selves. It sends a message that this is a place where a person can be themselves, where they can be open about who they are, that this is a safe, inclusive place. We want to recognize the diversity of the populations we serve. As Kieran talked a little bit about, we can use this data to support health and social equity efforts. In some cases, we can use this data to direct people to group-specific services. And then we can also use this data to distribute resources where we see needs or where we see resources aren't being appropriately distributed. And lastly, I want to point out that survey questions teach that they're not just there to collect data, but they also influence social norms, and they also influence our understanding of who's included and who's accepted in the populations we serve. When we see this list of identities listed, or of categories of experience, a lot of times folks will see terms that they haven't heard before, or people that they didn't really know were a part of their community, and it can trigger these thoughts or these questions about, like, what does this mean about my community? Do I need to rethink who is accepted, who is part of my community? It can also give people language for their experiences that they didn't necessarily have language for before, which can be a pretty crucial intervention for a lot of folks. Next slide. Something that you'll notice when we get into talking about the standards is that OHA's demographic standards are much more granular than most people's standards or most institution standards. And by granular, I mean there is a longer list of identities are presented. There is more data, basically more information about people's experiences is captured. And as Kieran pointed out earlier, people's experiences are complex, societies are complex, populations are complex, and so granular data is going to be better at representing that complexity than less granular data. And it also has more utility even when we need to report less granular data, because we can always take more specific information and aggregate it to match a less specific or a less granular standard. But the reverse is never true. We can't get more detailed information out of less detailed data. And so it's always better to have more information and need to aggregate than to not have the information you need to answer a question you're trying to answer. That said, aggregation and cross-mapping is not always a simple or straightforward process. It requires principled decision-making about how we're going to do this aggregation, how we're going to represent people's experiences, and requires that decision-making to be informed by community expertise. And then we also want to be very transparent about how and why those decisions were made, and sort of what effects we expect that to have on our ability to answer the questions that we're trying to answer or to represent people's experiences. Next slide. I'll pass it back to Kieran.
So we're going to do a little bit of history about what is the process for developing OHA's REALD and SOGI standards. I'm going to take you to the Candyland board that describes a process that is likely quite familiar to many people, given that we are all state public servants. But this is a little Candyland description of the rulemaking process that follows the passage of legislation. And that's the process under which we operate for updating the REALD and SOGI standards, because we are required to collect this data by legislative mandate, and so establishing the specific data standards, the questions, the response options, et cetera, requires moving through a rulemaking process. So I want to point your attention to the purplish boxes. We have opportunity for community engagement, which happens before draft text is even created, that there's this opportunity to get community input before you actually begin the formal rulemaking advisory committee process. And I want to, as an example, the SOGI standards, the sexual orientation and gender identity standards, Marty's going to talk about this more in a moment, but the establishment of the SOGI standards was really a multi-year effort that began with a community work group. I actually was a participant of this community work group before I came to work at the state back in 2018 and 2019, of community leaders, folks from different organizations, some academics, queer and trans people, who came together to actually work to draft questions that would be able to collect accurate, nuanced data about sexual orientation, sexuality, gender, sex, etc. And then once the legislation passed and the mandate came into existence, we had RAC meetings. We did a full RAC process with I think we had 4 or 5 RAC meetings where community members came together and reviewed and edited those draft standards that had been created by the community work group. And then, of course, we had the public hearings, and we received both verbal and written testimony that was from community members across a wide span of different institutions and individuals and organizations. And that was all of that was incorporated into these final standards that ended up being included in the permanent rules. So handing it to Marty to discuss some of the SOGI work group process.
Yeah, so initially we just had the REALD, the race, ethnicity, language, and disability rules. And in 2018, OHA began studying how can we better collect sexual orientation, and that expanded to include gender identity and sex as well. And so they drafted questions based off of intake forms from clinics that serve LGBTQ plus populations and from literature about national best practices. And this diagram on the right shows sort of all the different settings that were being considered while developing REALD and SOGI standards. So there's like in the center is the most restrictive or the needing the most sensitive personally identifiable information, things like physical health and clinic settings. And then as we go out, we move towards needing less identifiable information and being able to rely more on aggregated population level data. And so OHA wanted to create standards that could meet the needs of all of these different settings and protect the privacy and confidentiality of people's information while meeting all these various different setting needs. They then sent this feedback out they sent the draft they had out for feedback and received feedback from over 400 people across the state of Oregon. And one of the reasons that we're showing you this history of the development is that doing demographic data well, or developing standards for demographic data can take a lot of time and a lot of work and a lot of input from a lot of community. And one of our hopes as we were doing this work is that aside from the folks that OHA is like mandating to collect REALD and SOGI, there are a lot of people who want to collect demographic data and want to do it well, but don't have the time or resources to do this 10-year-long process of community engagement. And our hope is that we can save people some of that work, basically, and that people can take the fruits of that labor and use it how in a way that best meets their needs, even when they're not required by OHA to do so. And so it's, I think, helpful to talk a little bit about what the process was of coming up with these questions. And I'll pass it back to Kieran.
Yeah, and so now we're going to actually take a look at some of the questions, which I'm sure some folks have been like, this is a lot of intro to before we even get to what the questions are. But we are happy to get there. This is a link to a template of the full REALD and SOGI survey instrument. We are not going to be talking about the full survey instrument today. Rowan shared some of the demographic data that like what you all are actually mandated to collect by your statute. And noted that REALD and SOGI collects information about language, and you all are not mandated to collect information about language, for example. So we're not going to spend time today talking about our language questions. For anyone who is curious, you'll get these resources. It's also very easy to find the survey online via a quick Google search, and you are welcome to go take a look at the template. But we are going to jump into some of the questions that I think that Marty and I thought would actually be meaningful for you folks to consider implementing in your survey. So starting with what we call our race and ethnicity standards, I want to mention that I know you folks are asked to collect race, ethnicity, and national origin, and our questions include information about all of those concepts. So we have 3 questions about race or ethnicity. The first is an open text question that just is a text box that people can fill in. How do you identify your race, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, country of origin, or ancestry? And I'm going to actually come back to talking about the open text question in a few minutes. So I'm going to table that discussion for a few slides from now. But the second question, which is kind of the big one, is a multi-select question. Which of the following describes your racial or ethnic identity? And I do want to show you quickly what that question looks like on the survey, because it is worth actually seeing visually. Let me put it here. So we have this top question, open text, how do you just identify your race or ethnicity? And then the next question, which of the following describes your racial or ethnic identity? Select all that apply and enter additional details, again, if you have them. So we have headings here, which correspond to broad categories: Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, Hispanic and Latino, Jewish, Middle Eastern, Black and African American, etc. And then within each grouping, within each large group, there are what we call granular or detailed categories. And then if a person is, Asian, and they say, oh, none of these apply to me, I have a different Asian identity, they can write that into this text box here. And similarly for each of these groups. And then there is like another category not listed down here. And then you'll see in this question and in every single REALD and SOGI question, there are options for a person to say don't know and a person to say don't want to answer. So we always offer folks the opportunity to decline to answer a question. And so that is our structured questions. Folks can select all that apply. And then we have a third race or ethnicity question, which is if you selected more than one category, is there one that you think of as your primary racial or ethnic identity? And if they say yes, we ask them to tell us which identity they claim as this sort of a primary identity. They can, of course, decline to respond. They can say, I don't have just one primary racial or ethnic identity. They can also say, I identify as biracial or multiracial. And of course, they can say don't know or don't want to answer. And this primary race question gives us the opportunity to when we have to create tables later down the road, and when we think about, where folks get grouped together, lumping every person who selected more than one racial or ethnic identity into a big biracial or multiracial bucket may or may not be how a person would choose to have themselves identified in a table of identities. And so this is sort of giving folks the opportunity to tell us how they would prefer to be identified in that case. So those are the race and ethnicity questions that we use. And then disability questions, I will hand it off to Marty.
Yeah, so there are several ways of sort of defining disability. There is a medical model based off of diagnosis. There is an identity-based model where people can identify as disabled or not in one way or another. There's a social model where disability is seen as like an interaction between a person and their environment. And what we have found is that relying on any one of those ways of defining disability is going to result in undercounting of people with disabilities, basically. Because not everybody who has functional limitations or identifies as being disabled has a diagnosis of a disability, and not everybody who would have a diagnosis or has a functional limitation would identify as disabled. And so we tried to come up with questions that would sort of account for multiple different ways of defining disability. So first we have these functional limitation questions that ask about if people have difficulty with things like bathing or dressing, or if they are deaf or have serious difficulty hearing. And there's 9 of those questions. And so that's based off of like what difficulties a person's experiencing in their life. Next slide. There's also an open text disability question that asks people just if you identify as someone with a disability or as having a physical, mental, emotional, cognitive, or intellectual condition, to describe that disability or condition. And this allows us to capture people who may not have the functional limitations that are listed there or may not have a diagnosis, but who do have an identity that is or identify as disabled in one way or another, in the hopes that that will allow us to better count people with disabilities than just relying on the sort of more medicalized model of the 9 structured questions above. Next slide.
Oh, before we move on,
Oh,
I
yeah.
also want to mention we're skipping a few of our disability questions. The REALD survey also includes questions that ask people if they need or want accommodations, and if so, what accommodations they need or want to access services or in general. And we aren't covering those questions today because accommodations information is not included in your statutory mandate. And so that's just a note that's a piece that we're not covering.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to talk about the SOGI questions. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity. It also includes sex. And the SOGI questions are age inflected. Since y'all are looking at higher education, we're only going to look at the questions that are for people age 14 and older. Everyone over age 14 has the same questions. And it mirrors the way that we ask about race and ethnicity in that we start with an open-ended question, which was describe your gender in any way you prefer. And then we have these checkbox structured question, what is your gender? Select all that apply. Something I want to call attention to in this question is this, I have a gender identity not listed here that is specific to my ethnicity. And that comes from a couple things, mostly from conversations with our like indigenous colleagues in Oregon and with tribal folks in Oregon, that what we have heard is that when we ask people to consider their cultural or ethnic background, their answer to these questions can change. That people may answer differently if they're expecting this in a sort of strictly white Western context rather than when they're being asked to consider their culture or ethnicity. And that nuance isn't necessarily captured just by having this like not listed or this open text option. And we don't want to undercount culturally specific identities like Two-Spirit or like Mahu for Native Hawaiian contexts. We've also heard that when we just put terms like Two-Spirit or Mahu or Fa'afafine or any of the culturally specific identities, well, if we just have them as one of the structured options, that leads to appropriation from people who don't have any ties to the culture that identity stems from. And so we don't want to just have the culturally specific identities listed in with all these other identities. And so that's the reason for that section. Another way to solve that is if, and this will be in the future, but we don't quite have this like put together, is to have all of your response options for gender and sexual orientation linked to people's race and ethnicity responses. So if somebody responded that they are American Indian or Alaskan Native, then when they come to question 19, what is your gender? Two-Spirit would show as one of the options, whereas it might not for people who didn't select that option. That's not how it currently is, but that is coming in the future. Next slide. We also have a separate question for what is called gender modality. And gender modality is probably a new term to a lot of folks. Basically, a lot of data standards in the past and some current ones ask a gender question that looks something like, what is your gender? Select one, male, female, transgender. And the problem with that is that it forces people to choose whether to represent their transgender identity or whether to represent their gender identity as a man. And so it sends this message that trans men aren't men and trans women aren't women, but that there's some other thing. It's essentially denying their experience, and it causes erasure. And so asking if people are transgender, separate from asking about their gender identity, allows us to represent both people's gender identity and their gender modality. And the term gender modality, specifically, it means how a person's current gender identity relates to their gender assigned at birth. So a transgender man and a cisgender man have the same gender identity. They're both men. They have different gender modalities because one is transgender and one is cisgender. And so this ultimately just leads to better data, less erasure, less harm by asking this question separately. Next slide. We also ask about sexual orientation, and it mirrors the way we've been doing these questions, where we have describe your sexual orientation or sexual identity in any way you prefer, and then what is your sexual orientation? Select all that apply. Next slide. And then we ask about sex. And for sex, we just have the question, what is your sex? And that includes the options female, male, intersex, and not listed. And the reason we ask it this way, rather than asking about sex assigned at birth or sex on a particular documentation, is that we heard from intersex advocates and intersex community members is that intersex is very rarely on a person's sex assigned at birth. It's very rarely on a particular document. And so when we just ask about sex on some form of documentation, what we end up is undercounting or erasing intersex experiences. And we limit our ability to recognize inequities that are occurring that are harming intersex people by doing so. So instead we ask, what is your sex? And we're asking about essentially a person's current understanding of their sex or of their body. There is guidance that we have for how to collect sex on a particular document, but we're not going to talk about that here because it's not necessarily relevant. That's more of a healthcare setting thing. Next slide.
Sorry, Marty, can you remind me, is this a select one or a select all that apply question?
This one is select one. I think in the future it may be select all that apply, but for now it's a select one.
Got it. Thank you. Oh, and I was wondering if you wanted to speak to why this question is number 21 and not number 16.
Yeah, so this is something we have heard since we started, since the 2018 starting to look into how do we want to collect this, is that it's really important to collect gender identity first and sex second, for a lot of reasons. One, that collecting sex first feels to a lot of folks like it's sort of giving sex this sort of primary importance, or a fancy term would be bioessentialism. It also is more clear in that past demographic standards have often conflated sex and gender. And so when a person encounters the question, what is your sex? It's not always clear if this question is really asking about sex, about a person's body, or if it's asking about gender identity. The question, the question that asks about gender identity is very clear because terms like gender fluid or demigirl or non-binary are very clearly gender terms. So that when people get to the sex question, they know okay, I've already been asked about gender. This is specifically about sex, not about gender. So it ends up getting better data by doing it that way.
Thank you.
I'll pass it back to Kieran.
Yeah, we want to take a moment to talk about some of the data equity practices that are built into REALD and SOGI, and some of them we've already talked about, so I might try to skim a little bit some of this information. But to start, we include open-ended questions. I promised I'd come back to it, but I want to draw your attention to the use of open-ended questions. One of the first pieces of feedback we received from communities was that no matter how detailed, no matter how granular, excellent your demographic questions are, and no matter how community-driven your process, there are always going to be people whose identities are not captured using a checkbox. This could be because their experience is wholly or partially absent from the list of checkboxes, or because a person just doesn't believe in labels. So communities asked us to include space for individuals to write in responses and describe their identities using their own words. So the standards include these 4 questions. You've seen all 4 of them about race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. These questions are always appearing in addition to the structured checkbox style questions, because functionally, if we want to analyze the data, we do need checkbox style questions. Organizations that are serving an individual can use this written in data to better understand and provide services. And then during data processing for aggregation, there are also methods to use this open text data in a number of ways. For example, to help inform future changes to the standards, and by helping us identify experiences that might be missing from structured questions. And then this is Marty, actually. Some general data equity practices.
So some of these may or may not apply depending on your needs. One of the things that we did in the REALD and SOGI standards is we put the language and disability questions first, because those are ones that can help us identify access needs. It's not very helpful to get all the way through the form and realize that we haven't been meeting somebody's access needs that could have been met at the beginning of this process. It's also really important that every question has non-response options like don't know or don't want to answer. People need to feel safe not responding to these questions if they don't want to. They need to understand that the services or care or whatever they're there for is not going to change based off of whether or not they answer these questions. And then there's also skip logic and display logic that is used throughout to reduce survey fatigue and burden. This is especially true in electronic forms, but there is some of this logic also applies in paper forms. There's also some subject-specific ones. We mentioned including intersex and not listed in the sex question. It's actually fairly rarely included on sex questions, but it's really important to be able to represent those experiences. And then I talked a little bit about asking about gender modality separately. The primary race question lets people choose to identify either as a primary race or as multiracial. And then the bit about disability, where we have attempting to capture sort of different needs and experiences and different ways of defining disability in our questions. I'll pass it back to Kieran.
Yeah, so want to speak to some of the concerns that sometimes come up when we talk about collecting demographic data, and particularly when we talk about collecting detailed demographic data. There are often concerns about privacy, right? Who can see an individual's data? What controls do individuals have over who sees their data? How is data going to be aggregated and shared so that people aren't identifiable when the data is released? One way of responding to these concerns is to point out that there's a lot of sensitive data out there that is collected all of the time, and very careful and intentional data privacy practices exist for all sorts of sensitive data. Demographic data is no different in this sense. Knowing that you all will be instructing campuses to ensure that certain data privacy practices are in place, because the data that you're collecting is incredibly sensitive data, that this is already going to be something that you are thinking deeply and carefully about. Autonomy, risk, and erasure. So another concern that comes up when we talk about especially SOGI data, but it also comes up with disability data often, and sometimes also with language and race and ethnicity, is that there is some inherent risk associated with disclosing these identities, particularly risks around being outed, risks around how people will respond and react if you're sharing this information with a provider or if the survey is being administered over the phone or something like that. And there are inherent risks in collecting demographic data, but there are also risks inherent in not collecting that data. And primarily the risk that we're concerned about is erasure. If we aren't asking about a specific identity or experience, that means we're not counting those people. And if we can't count people, we can't know whether the systems are harming them, whether we're meeting the needs of those people and populations. So one thing that I point out a lot when we talk about especially SOGI data is that when you ask the questions, you give a person the opportunity to choose how to answer, to choose what level of risk they feel comfortable with. And of course, folks can always decline to respond. They can always choose whether or not they want to participate in their own representation. But if you institutionally take away that option, it is contributing to erasure and stripping people of the autonomy to make decisions about their own representation.
Another concern we hear about is backlash. Communities that have been harmed by inequities may feel mistrustful of institutions, of government, and there are good reasons for this. There is a long history of institutions harming people using their data. And we also know that people with certain belief systems may react with hostility when asked about certain aspects of their identities or when presented with certain demographic questions. For example, sexual orientation. If somebody feels that certain sexual orientations carry negative moral connotations, they may feel upset when they're asked about this. This is kind of built into equity work, or it's a necessary problem in equity work, where equity work requires us to identify populations who experience inequities and center the experiences of those most harmed by these inequities. And oftentimes the way those inequities are created is via stigma. And so being asking about something that's stigmatized is going to carry this risk of backlash. It's necessary for equity work. It's an important part of equity work is attempting to reduce that stigma over time, and that means wrestling with that stigma and wrestling with the harm that's been caused in the past. Next slide. The other thing we have is labor equity, and we talked a little bit about why we have these really detailed questions, but it's important to think about, like, these questions take time to answer, and the reason for that is because of this complexity. It's because we want our demographic information to reflect that complexity of people and societies, and that means it's going to take more time, work, and resources to collect the data and to respond to those questions. But the value that we get in our ability to do equity work and the value we get from inclusive representation is proportional to that time, work, and resources that we put into it. Next slide. I just want to close on a point about making meaning from demographic data. When we make decisions about data, it's easy to get kind of in the weeds of a particular concern or like analysis considerations, and those are always important. But it's really important to keep this point of meaning making in mind, of why are we collecting this data? What are we hoping to do with it? What questions are we trying to answer? And ultimately, whether or not we try to tell a story with data, data tells a story about the people and the populations who provided the data. And we want to be really conscious of what that story is, and do these stories resonate with the communities they're about? Are these stories strength-based? And ultimately, do these stories reproduce stigma or perpetuate historical harm, or do they help to reduce that stigma or to alleviate that harm? And that is everything we have for y'all.
We've got a slide in here pointing you to our website. We have a detailed implementation guide that is sort of in the process of being put online that will talk a lot more about some of the details of implementing REALD and SOGI questionnaires. We have data templates. We have a data dictionary, which is intended to help data systems think about how they're storing and collecting this data. And so would point folks to the website for more information. And then this is how you can reach Marty and I, or how you can reach our general REALD and SOGI question box. And that is all we have for you. But it looks like we have about 10 minutes and are so excited to get questions and to work through what you're thinking about. I see Belle.
I just want to say thank you so much for doing this, and I do really, really like the SOGI part of it. I think that part would actually be very helpful for the survey writing committee. So I just have a short question about copyright. Does this survey have copyright if we just literally just use the SOGI part, or we maybe eventually decide to revise it slightly for our survey? Would that be a copyright issue?
No, you can copy and paste it straight from how it is, and that's part of the hope of how we published it. Is yeah.
Yeah. Generally keeping attribution in mind. Mostly it's helpful for you all in the future to say where your questions came from, more than like credit necessarily. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
I know one of the things that we have taught. Oh, I'm sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize if I missed this. I had to step out for a second, but do y'all have a glossary of terms or anything that people have access to while they're filling out the survey if they have questions about terminology?
Yes, I'll put that in the chat. And that will be part of the implementation guide, which so it's technically a work in progress, the implementation guide is, but I think it will always be a work in progress because we're always going to keep adding as new resources are needed. So I'm just going to put the link to that guide there. And here is the glossary for SOGI. Kieran, I don't know if there's a glossary for the REALD parts, but
There are tooltips and such. So if people are implementing this in an electronic survey and you want like hover text over certain words and things like that, we do have recommended tooltips for pretty much every section of the survey. And I would point folks to the implementation guide as it goes live. I'm hesitant to share any resource that hasn't quite made it on the website yet. But yes, we do have tooltips and resources to help folks understand terms. Adia? And I apologize if I did not say your name correctly.
I'm worried about it. I just wanted to know for African Americans, do you distinguish all the different categories? Because I usually just see African American and Black, or sometimes there's African Caribbean and there's African, and there's so many different varieties. And then all of a sudden, recently, people are saying this ADOS, African descendant of slaves, or there's like so
No.
many things that people want to be called these days. And because there are some, or as first and second generation immigrants tend
Mm-hmm.
to be better off, not say better off, but uh, was to excel a little bit more than most of the people who've been here
Mm-hmm.
since like the 1800s, those who've been
Mm-hmm.
descendant of slavery. They're the financially a little different and behind, and other than recent immigrants.
Yeah.
So there were some people talking about distinguishing those categories because I
Yeah.
think the most successful immigrants are like Nigerians. They're very so I can't see. Let me look again.
Yeah,
I don't
and
have
that's
my glasses on.
precisely, let me
Mhm.
zoom in on it a little bit. That's precisely why we have that's like a really excellent example of why we have all of these granular categories, is because the experience of a Nigerian person or a person of Nigerian descent, recent Nigerian descent, may be very different from African American and Afro-Caribbean folks. And then of course we also have this open text box where someone who can say, I'm Black or African American, none of these quite capture my experience. I'm going to write in some details about myself. And then within the REALD and SOGI data repository, we are actually keeping track of what folks are writing in. And when we go to revise the standards again in a few years, we'll be looking at all that open text data and saying, hey, a lot of people have started identifying as African descendants of slavery. And if And then we'll take that to the community members who are a part of our process and say, we're seeing this a lot. Talk to us about what it would mean to include this. Is this a term that's like kind of achieving a status where folks in the community would understand it if they saw it on our survey? Is it something that folks want on our survey? A good example of something like that happening is this SWANA down here with Middle Eastern and North African. We heard from community members that Middle Eastern and North African, this MENA term is a Eurocentrist term. What is the Middle East of, right? And so this description, SWANA, actually stands for Southwest Asian and North African, because that is a more geographically accurate way to describe the region of the world. But we couldn't simply replace MENA with SWANA because not enough people will know what SWANA means necessarily, because folks are more accustomed to seeing Middle Eastern and North African as the term. And so we've included it here as a sort of way of saying we acknowledge that this is emerging language in the community and we are tracking it. And so that's the kind of work that's happening in the community engagement circles that REALD and SOGI is working in.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? We have just a couple more minutes.
I know one of the questions that we've talked about a little bit is when we're aggregating, what kinds of cell sizes are most helpful, and that's such a nuanced answer. But I think one of the things we'd sort of talked about was that when we do have to aggregate to protect privacy, being transparent in what we're doing, so that we are not just saying, oh, well, these are all the Black and African American people, but we're saying we are aggregating these categories to protect the privacy of the individuals who identified within this category or something like that. Do you have any other tips for us as we start to think about how we might aggregate this?
Only that I know that various agencies have done a lot of data aggregation and have like pretty specific rules about at what threshold you have to aggregate. And so, I don't know whether that's true of HEC or if you folks have close partners who do more work with data who you could reach out to about kind of norms around data aggregation. The general practices that I mentioned to folks are make sure that your aggregation makes sense. So you have one person who identified as Dominican and another person, and one person who identified as Samoan. Don't just aggregate those two people together so that you have a group, because there's nothing that they necessarily, in terms of race or ethnicity, like make sure your aggregation is logical and connected to who these people are and what they share. But then, otherwise making sure that there is transparency about how aggregation happened and why is like the number one consideration.
And to get a little academic with it, one of the things that we'll say with demographic categories is that they are often used as proxies for interactions with systems of power. And when we think about it that way, it helps us to think about how to aggregate, because if we think about like what systems are acting on people, how do those interactions with systems work, then we can come up with groups that have sort of similar interactions with these systems as a way of aggregating when we need to. Just as sorry, as Kieran said, we're both epidemiologists, so we'll nerd out about that. But that is, it kind of comes into this, like, what questions are we trying to answer? When we do our aggregating, we can keep that in mind. It helps us have good reasons for why we are grouping responses together in the way we do.
Yeah. Often you might see a disparity or a significant result for a group where you've just classified everyone with more than one identity as multiracial. And then you're like, well, we can't theorize at all about why this group of people might have a significant result, or like, because we can't theorize at all about what kind of shared experiences they might be having.
I can see this being something to continue talking about quite a bit. Adea, I see your hand. I just want to acknowledge it is noon, and if our friends are able to stick around for a few more questions, that's great. But otherwise, I am happy to share your email addresses via email with folks if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
Great.
email addresses are great. I'm happy to stay for another couple minutes if needed.
Okay, thanks.
Same.
I just had one question about the disability question being asked first. And it's because when you ask it, you actually change the survey based on the disability, like if there's a reading disability or something like that, or find there's something going on.
Yeah.
So you immediately change the survey.
It more applies if you include the accommodations question, but it can apply if someone says that they're, blind or have serious difficulty seeing and they say yes, then that creates an opportunity to say, oh, do you need this survey in an alternate format? But, if you had included the accommodations questions, you might get lots of specific information about what kind of accommodations a person might need to complete a survey. Yes, so that's why we order the disability questions up front. If that is not a practice that you're going to be able to recommend or make provision for, that would be a different conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all so much again. It was good to see everybody here, and I wish you all the happiest of holidays. And thanks so much, Karen and Marty. I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah, it's great getting to
Thank you
meet you
so
all.
much.
Take care.
Thanks, y'all.